The gun went off. Not at the stag, not at Clara Briggs, but close enough to the cold October air between them that the birds roosting in the oaks above Ashford Forest broke from their branches all at once, rising like torn paper flung against a pale and still sky, and the sound of the shot rolled across the frost-hardened ground and reached every corner of the Ashford estate before the echo had even finished dying in the distance. Clara did not run. She stood at the edge of the tree line with her arms full of fallen wood, her worn leather boots pressing lightly into the soft earth beneath the oaks, her breath coming out in small white clouds that dissolved into the cold air before they reached the barrel of the rifle still angled in her direction. She was not thinking about bravery. She was not thinking about dignity, or about the rights of working women in the county of Shropshire in the autumn of 1887. She was thinking that the wood in her arms was heavy, and that if she let it fall she would have to pick every piece up again from the ground, and that her youngest child had been coughing since Tuesday, and the fire at the cottage had gone cold twice in the past week because there was not enough fuel to keep it through the night. Duke Edmund Ashford lowered the rifle by 3 inches. No more than that. He was 51 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been genuinely handsome in his younger years, and had settled over the decades into something harder and more certain of itself. The face of a man who had spent a long time having things go the way he expected them to go. He had ridden out before dawn that morning with 4 men at his back, the same 4 men who had accompanied him on every October hunt for 11 consecutive years, and the stag they had been tracking since the eastern gate was a particular animal, a large male with a distinctive rack that had eluded the Duke twice before, once in the 2nd year of the hunt and once just last autumn. He had earned that shot through patience and early mornings and careful approach. He had moved into the wind for 40 minutes with the horses kept quiet, and his men silent behind him, and he had waited for the stag to step clear of the tree line and stand still in the open ground, and when the moment had finally come, this woman had walked directly into the line of fire with an armful of fallen wood, and the calm, unremarkable expression of someone who had not yet understood what she had done. "Move," he said. The word was not loud. It had no need to be loud. 3 decades of having his instructions carried out without requiring a second repetition had made his words precise and economical, and he used them the way an experienced craftsman uses a well-maintained tool, with the quiet confidence of someone who has never once had reason to doubt the outcome. Clara Briggs looked at him. She was 34 years old. Her husband George had died the previous February, taken by a fever that had spread through the workers' cottages along the southern edge of the Ashford estate the way water finds every crack in old stone, slowly and without mercy, settling into every weak place until what was there before is gone. She had 3 children. She had a position in the estate laundry house that paid 11 shillings a week, which was not enough for 4 people but was what was available, and so she made it work by waking before 4 each morning, and not sleeping until after 10 each night, and coming to the forest floor on her half-day Thursdays to collect the fallen wood that cost nothing because it was already on the ground, because firewood that had to be bought cost money she did not have. She had been gathering wood in this way for 7 months without incident, because the Duke never rode the eastern quarter of the estate before noon, and every person who lived and worked on or near the Ashford lands knew his riding patterns the way you know the weather patterns when your livelihood depends on reading them correctly every single day. But the stag had moved north toward the denser oak stands, and the Duke had followed it, and Clara had been moving quietly between the trees and had not heard the approach of the horses on the soft ground until they were already close, and now here they were, 15 yards apart in the pale October morning, and the Duke had said one word to her. She looked at him for a long moment, longer than was comfortable for anyone watching. She was not making a calculated decision in any deliberate sense. She was simply exhausted in the particular and specific way of a woman who has been carrying the full weight of a family alone for nearly a year, an exhaustion that had reached the place behind her eyes where a different kind of fear used to live, and had filled that space completely, leaving no room for the ordinary alarm that a common woman was expected to feel when a titled man pointed a gun in her direction and gave her a single clear instruction. She adjusted the wood in her arms to get a more secure grip on the lower pieces. She did not step aside. One of the men behind the Duke made a sound, something caught between a word and a held breath. A horse tossed its head and stamped once. The stag, which had been standing 30 yards beyond Clara at the tree line, its breath visible in the cold air, turned its great head once, and then was simply gone, swallowed back into the dark between the oaks without a sound, as though the forest had made a quiet decision to take it back. The Duke watched it disappear. The muscle along his jaw tightened once and then released. He turned his eyes back to Clara. "What is your name?" he said. It was not a question the way questions are usually formed. It was the opening line of a process that Clara recognized, because she had watched it applied to others on the estate over the years she had worked there. A name became a record. A record led to a consequence. The nature of the consequence was rarely in question. "Clara Briggs," she said. "I work in the laundry house. You are on private land. I am on the common wood margin," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that sometimes surprises people who expect a servant woman in a servant's coat to yield immediately under the weight of a duke's direct attention. "The boundary is the 3-stone row. I am standing 12 feet on the right side of it." This was true. She had measured the distance herself, 6 weeks earlier, on a clear morning when she had brought a length of cord from the laundry house and walked the margin carefully before she began collecting, because Clara Briggs was not a careless person. She was, in fact, a very careful one, careful in the way that people become when the difference between careful and not careful is the difference between your family eating and your family going without. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Behind him, Aldous Hewitt, the land manager who had worked the Ashford estate for 16 years, and had become extremely skilled at reading the precise meaning of the Duke's silences, leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "I can have her removed, Your Grace," Hewitt said quietly, in the low and practical tone he reserved for all unpleasant practical matters that needed to be handled efficiently. Clara watched the Duke's face. He was calculating something. She could see it in the flat gray eyes, the small arithmetic that men of his position had been raised to make almost without conscious thought, balancing a principle against an audience of 4 men. Measuring the cost of one action against the cost of another, weighing the shot that was already lost against the instruction that still needed a result. The Stag was gone. That side of the equation was already settled. "Remove her from the grounds," the Duke said. "All grounds. Terminate her position at the laundry house." He did not look at Clara when he said it. He was already turning the horse back toward the eastern trail, the rifle resting across his knee, his posture carrying the particular quality of a man who has disposed of a matter and is now returning his attention to more important things. Clara stood and watched him ride away. The wood was still heavy in her arms. She shifted her grip again out of habit, before she remembered that she was not bringing it home. Hewitt had already dismounted and was walking toward her across the soft ground with the careful expression of a man who is required to deliver news he did not write and does not enjoy reading aloud. She set the wood down in a neat stack against the base of the nearest oak. She did not know exactly why she stacked it neatly, perhaps because it had taken her an hour to collect and it seemed wrong to simply let it fall in disorder. Perhaps because she was Clara Briggs, and Clara Briggs did not leave things in disorder, regardless of the circumstances around her. "I am sorry," Hewitt said, and his eyes confirmed that he was, which was almost worse than if he had been indifferent. "When must I go?" she said. "End of the week. The cottage is tied to the position." He paused for a moment. "I will write you a reference, a thorough one, something you can take anywhere." She nodded once. She looked at the neat stack of wood she had just left against the tree, wood she had gathered and could not take, sitting beside a tree she did not own, on a margin of ground where she was no longer permitted to stand. She walked home. The morning was still cold. The birds had not returned to the oak branches yet. The frost was softening only at the edges where the thin autumn sun managed to reach the ground, and somewhere far inside the forest there was no sound at all, which meant the Stag was gone entirely, and the Duke was already riding back toward a house with 14 fireplaces and a kitchen that began warming at 5 o'clock every morning of the year. Clara walked the full 2 miles back to the cottage without stopping. Her daughter Nell was at the kitchen table feeding the youngest, a boy of 4 named Peter, who looked up when the door opened and said her name in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that young children say the names of the people who hold their entire world in place. Clara sat down at the table. "We need to talk," she said to Nell, who was 12 years old and already old enough to read a face clearly, and who set the spoon down carefully before she turned around. Outside the cottage window, a crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the small yard, and sat there without moving, as patient and still as if it had decided to wait and see what this particular family would do next. The week after the hunt passed, the way bad weeks always pass, not quickly and not slowly, but in separate pieces that each had their own weight and had to be managed one at a time rather than all at once. Clara told the children on the first evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the fire going and the curtains drawn against the dark. She told them simply and in plain language, the way she told them everything that needed to be said. They were going to lose the cottage. She was looking for a new position and would find one. They would stay with their Aunt Dorothy in Ludlow while she found it, and that would take as long as it took, and as long as it took was as long as it took, and there was no use in adding worry to it. Nobody cried. This was partly because Clara did not cry, and partly because her children had learned from years of watching her that feelings were real and honest things, but they were not reasons to stop doing the next thing that needed doing. Nell sat very quietly for a long time after Clara had finished speaking. Then she said, "What happened?" Clara told her. All of it. From the wood to the rifle to the word move to the stag walking back into the forest. Nell was quiet again for a while. Then, "Did you do anything wrong?" "No," Clara said. Nell nodded, very slowly, the way a 12-year-old nods when she is pressing something important into a permanent place, storing it somewhere inside herself where it will sit and take root and become, over the years, part of the ground she stands on. On Tuesday morning, Clara went to the estate office at the main house to collect the wages owed to her for the completed portion of the week. Hewitt was there. He counted the money and gave it to her without making her ask for any of it, which was a small but genuine act of decency. He also pressed into her hand a sealed letter, the reference he had promised, written in careful professional language that described her accurately and well, without mentioning the hunt or the rifle or the stag or anything at all about the morning in the forest. "There is a laundry house in Bridgenorth," he said quietly, in the voice he used when he was speaking for himself and not for the estate. "The Calvert Mill. I have a cousin who works there in a supervisory position. If you would allow me, I could send a word ahead on your behalf." Clara held the letter in both hands and looked at it. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without reservation. She was not a person who withheld thanks when they had been genuinely earned. But she did not leave the office quite yet. "Mr. Hewitt," she said, "the land I was standing on that morning, was it estate land?" He shifted slightly in his chair. "There is some uncertainty regarding the boundary markers," he said carefully. "The common margin was mapped and recorded in 1841. The boundary stones have moved somewhat over the intervening years." "Then he had no proper right to remove me," she said. Hewitt looked at his desk for a moment, then at the wall, then back at her. "His Grace has rights in this county that extend somewhat beyond the ones that are written in the public documents," he said, and he was not being dismissive or cruel. He was being honest about the shape of the world as it actually was, which in certain moments is a heavier thing than cruelty. Clara folded the reference letter and put it in her coat pocket. She walked out of the estate office and through the main iron gate and down the lane toward the village, and she walked quickly because she was trying to think clearly, which was difficult because something had settled in her chest during the past week that was not quite grief, and was not quite anger, and was not cleanly either one, but lived in the space between them, something harder and quieter that did not have a simple name. She went to see the solicitor. Gerald Combs operated out of 2 small rooms above the butcher's shop on the main street and smelled, permanently and without apology, faintly of ink and old paper. She had walked past his door a great many times over the years she had lived near the village, and had never once gone in. She went in now. Combs was a small man with careful, attentive eyes and reading glasses that he habitually wore pushed up on his forehead even when he was not reading anything. He listened to Clara's complete account without interrupting her once, which was the most professional thing about him. When she finished, he set his pencil down flat on the desk. "You were on common margin land," he said. "Yes. And you can prove this. The boundary stones are there. The 1841 map is a public record." Hewitt himself acknowledged that the boundary has been uncertain since the stones shifted. Combs picked the pencil up again and tapped it twice against the desk. "A magistrate in this county," he said, "will not find it an easy or a pleasant thing to rule against the Duke of Ashford." "I understand that," Clara said. "Then why are you sitting in my office?" She thought about it honestly, with the same care she applied to everything. She had 3 children. She had 11 shillings a week and now not even that. She had a cottage she was losing at the end of the week, and a persistent cough in her youngest child, and approximately no margin of any kind for anything to go further wrong than it already had. "Because what he did was wrong," she said, "and I would like it to be written down somewhere that it was wrong. Somewhere other than the inside of my own head." Combs looked at her for a long time with his careful eyes. "I cannot work for nothing," he said finally. "I have a business to maintain and a reputation in this village to consider." "I have very little money," Clara said. "How little?" She told him the exact figure. He looked at the window. He looked at his desk. He looked back at her. 2 shillings, he said. "Against my better professional judgment, and with the full and clear understanding that you will almost certainly lose this hearing, and that losing will change nothing about your current situation, except to remove 2 shillings from your pocket that you cannot easily spare." "File the complaint," she said. She placed the 2 shillings on his desk. She walked out of the office and back along the main street and past the estate gate on her way home, without turning her head to look at it. The complaint would be heard by the local magistrate, a man named Arthur Fenwick, who had been part of the very first October hunt on the Ashford estate 11 years ago, riding with the Duke on the same trails through the same forest where Clara had been standing with her armful of wood. This was a detail that Clara did not know. The world had arranged it around her like furniture placed in a room before she arrived, and she walked into the room without knowing the furniture had been positioned. The hearing date was set for the following Thursday morning. She spent the remaining days of the week packing what needed to be packed and moving her children and their belongings to Dorothy's house in Ludlow. Dorothy was married to a baker named Frank and had 4 children of her own and a small house with exactly 1 spare room, and she received Clara's family without complaint and without excessive questions, and put a large pot of soup on the stove on the first evening that served everyone at the table, and left enough warming on the back of the stove for the morning. Clara slept that night for the first time in 8 days without waking in the middle hours. She woke anyway at 4 in the morning, from long habit, and lay in the unfamiliar darkness for a moment before she remembered that there was no laundry to start and no fire to build up for a working morning. She lay still and listened to the breathing in the next room. All 4 of her children and 2 of Dorothy's mixed together in the deep and uncomplicated rhythm that a room full of small sleeping people makes. She thought about Thursday. She was not afraid of the hearing, which was not courage in any dramatic sense but was more the particular clarity that comes when you have already lost everything there was to lose, and the thing coming next is simply the next thing to deal with. And Clara Briggs dealt with what came next. She got up quietly before Dorothy and went downstairs and helped start the bread for the bakery, because it needed to be done and she was awake and it was something useful to do with her hands. By 7 in the morning the kitchen was warm and smelled of something plain and real and steady, and outside the small window the Ludlow morning was gray and entirely unimpressed by the fact that in 6 days, Clara Briggs was going to walk into a magistrate's court and stand in front of a man who had been invited to the Duke of Ashford's dinner table on a regular basis for as long as anyone in the county could comfortably remember. The bread rose in the pans exactly as it was supposed to. Clara shaped it with her hands, pressing it down and folding it, pressing and folding, the same motion she had made 1,000 times, and she thought about the 1841 boundary map, and about the 3 stones that everyone who knew them agreed had shifted from their original positions, and about the look on Hewitt's face when he had said, with genuine honesty, that some rights were broader than the ones written down. She pressed the dough down one more time. She was ready for Thursday. The magistrate's court in Ashton Cross had 12 wooden benches arranged in rows and 1 tall north-facing window that admitted a pale and thin light throughout the morning hours. The room smelled of old paper and coal smoke and the faint mustiness of a space that is used regularly but never aired properly, and it had not been built for the comfort of the people who sat in it, because nobody who built it had considered that comfort to be a relevant design requirement. Clara arrived 20 minutes before the hearing was called. She took her seat in the 3rd row from the front on the left-hand side of the room, in her good dress, which was her only good dress, made from a dark gray wool that had been her mother's, and had been carefully let out at the side seams twice to fit her properly. She had her hair pinned up with particular neatness, and her hands folded together in her lap and, lying flat on the bench beside her, the 1841 county boundary map that she had collected from the records office at 6 that morning, at a cost of 4 pennies. She was the only person in the room who had brought any evidence at all. Gerald Combs arrived 7 minutes later, slightly out of breath, with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and one side of his overcoat still unbuttoned. He sat down beside her, looked at the boundary map, and gave a single nod with the expression of a man who is trying to feel more confident than he actually is. The Duke's legal representative arrived at 9:15. The Duke himself was not present. He had sent a man named Pemberton from a Shrewsbury firm, tall and precisely dressed in a dark coat that was cut well, carrying his documents in a leather case of the particular quality that communicates wealth before a single word has been spoken. Pemberton walked to the front of the room and sat down and did not look around at anyone in the benches behind him, which was itself a deliberate and effective kind of looking. The benches filled gradually as the hearing time approached. Workers from the Ashford estate who had heard the story through the close network of people who lived and worked on that land, a farmer from the northern edge of the estate, 2 women from the village who recognized Clara from the Thursday market and had come to sit with her, in the way that people sometimes sit with someone they know when they sense that the person is going to need to be seen by friendly faces, a retired schoolteacher who had no connection to anyone involved but who attended every public proceeding in the village on principle. And, in the very last row on the right-hand side, almost entirely invisible in a brown wool coat and a pair of plain and unremarkable boots, a young man with a notebook open on his knee who had arrived in the courtroom before any of them, and who had not yet written a single word in the notebook. He was simply waiting, in the alert and still way that certain people wait when they sense that something is about to happen, that they need to be fully present for. His name was Oliver Ward. He was 23 years old and had been working for the Shrewsbury Chronicle for 14 months. He had been sent to Ashton Cross that Thursday morning to cover a boundary dispute between two farmers concerning a drainage ditch on the eastern side of the village, which was the kind of routine local story he had been assigned to cover almost exclusively since joining the paper. But when he arrived at the court, the clerk at the desk had told him that the drainage ditch case had been postponed until the following week, and that there was another matter set to begin at 9:30, a complaint brought by a laundrywoman against the Ashford estate, if he wanted to stay and see what it amounted to. He had wanted to stay. Magistrate Arthur Fenwick entered the room at exactly 9:30 in the morning, a man of 60 with a solid build and the unhurried, measured movements of someone who has presided at the front of many rooms over many years and is entirely comfortable being the heaviest presence in any of them. He arranged his papers on the bench in front of him. He put on his reading glasses. He looked out at the room over the top of them. Clara looked back at him steadily. Fenwick had, as Clara did not know, ridden with the Duke on the first October hunt 11 years ago. He had also, in the years since, made two significant decisions regarding common land access and grazing margin disputes that any close observer would have described as fair-minded. Clara did not know either of these things, and neither fact would have changed what she was about to do. The case was called. Pemberton spoke first. He was efficient, practiced, and spoke in the complete and well-constructed sentences of a professional man who charges by the hour and knows the value of not wasting words. He set out the Duke's position with clean clarity. Clara Briggs had been found on private estate land during the conduct of a formal licensed hunt, had refused to comply with a lawful instruction to vacate that land, and had thereby obstructed a lawful activity on private property. He cited two relevant statutes. He referenced the estate's boundary records as established by a survey in 1863. He did not mention the 1841 map. Combs stood next and spoke in a plainer style without any attempt at the kind of polish that Pemberton had, which was in its own way more persuasive because it was clearly genuine. He presented the 1841 boundary map and drew the court's attention to the specific recorded position of the common margin. He noted that the 1863 survey post dated a documented movement of the physical boundary stones and was therefore based on an inaccurate physical reference. He argued that Clara had been standing on common margin land that was not private estate land, that she had committed no trespass, and that her dismissal from employment had been taken against her as a consequence of her lawful presence on ground she had every right to occupy. Then Fenwick looked at Clara and indicated that she might speak. She stood up. Combs had told her to keep it short. She kept it short. "I was collecting fallen wood from the forest floor," she said, and her voice was clear and did not waver. "I was standing on the right side of the boundary stones, where I have always stood on these mornings. I did not hear the hunting party approaching until they were already close to me. I did not immediately move because no one had told me I was on estate land, because I was not on estate land, and the first thing anyone said to me was simply the instruction to move." She paused. "I was removed from a position I had held for 4 years, and put out of the cottage where my children live. I have not committed a trespass. I have not broken any law. I would like the record of this proceeding to say so." She sat down. Fenwick looked at the boundary map for a long time. He looked at Pemberton's documents. He looked at Combs. He looked at Clara again with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, the expression of a man who has received something that does not fit easily into any of the categories he prepared for the morning's business. In the last row, Oliver Ward's pencil had not stopped moving. Fenwick asked 3 questions. He asked Pemberton to give him the precise date recorded on the 1863 boundary survey. Pemberton located the document and read the date aloud. Fenwick wrote it down carefully. He asked Combs to read the specific language of the 1841 map legend that defined the common margin boundary. Combs read it. Fenwick wrote it down. He looked at Clara. "At any point before you were given the instruction to vacate," he said, "did any member of the hunting party state to you that you were standing on private estate land?" "No," Clara said. "No one stated that. The first word spoken to me was the instruction itself." Fenwick wrote something on the paper in front of him. He reviewed what he had written. He removed his reading glasses. "The complaint is dismissed," he said. The room took a breath. "The question of the boundary line is a matter for the county land office and is properly outside the jurisdiction of this court. However, I find no evidence of deliberate trespass on the complainant's part, and I find that the instruction given to her was not accompanied by a sufficient explanation of its legal basis for compliance to be legally required. The record will note that Clara Briggs left the area once the matter was explained more fully to her, and that no deliberate obstruction of any kind was established. Pemberton sat entirely still. Regarding the termination of employment, Fenwick continued, in the same measured tone, the estate's right to manage its own staff is a matter that falls outside this court today. However, I will note for the record that the specific grounds cited as the basis for that termination, namely the obstruction of a lawful hunt on private estate land, are not supported by the evidence that has been placed before me this morning. He set his glasses down. That is my finding in this matter. He rose, and the room rose with him, and then he walked out, and the sound of the door closing behind him was the only sound for a moment. Clara sat still. Combs was already folding his papers with hands that were not quite steady, working hard not to look as surprised as he genuinely was. Pemberton closed his leather case with a precise, controlled click, stood, and walked out of the room without making eye contact with anyone, or saying a word to anyone. Clara picked up the 1841 boundary map and folded it carefully along its original printed crease lines, pressing each fold flat with her thumb. In the last row, Oliver Ward was still writing. He wrote for 3 full minutes after everyone else in the room had begun to stand and move toward the door, bent over the notebook with the particular concentration of someone who has understood, somewhere in the past hour, that they are sitting inside something that will matter, if not to a great many people, then to the right ones. He closed the notebook, put it inside his coat, stood, walked out into the gray November air. By the time he reached the far end of the lane, he had already formed the first sentence of his piece. Clara came out of the courtroom behind him and stood for a moment at the top of the stone steps with her hand on the iron railing of the door, and she breathed the cold air in slowly. The complaint had been dismissed. The dismissal from the estate laundry house still stood. The cottage was still gone. She had 3 children in her sister's spare room in Ludlow, and no position, and 2 shillings fewer than she had begun the week with, and the February cough in Peter had not fully cleared. She held the folded map with both hands. But the record now said, in the language of a formal judicial proceeding, that she had done nothing wrong. She let go of the railing and turned toward the road. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. She began the walk back toward Ludlow. Oliver Ward's piece ran in the Shrewsbury Chronicle on Saturday morning, 3 days after the hearing. He had written it with the kind of care that a young journalist brings to a story when he knows, without quite being able to explain why yet, that it is better than the things he usually covers. He had written it 6 times in whole or in part before it was what he wanted it to be, and he had stayed at the Chronicle's office until past midnight on the Thursday to get it right. The editor, a man named Griffiths who had been running the paper for 22 years and who had initially suggested that Ward cut the piece by half, read the final version on Friday morning and moved it from page 4 to page 2, above the fold. The article ran to 900 words. It described the hearing in factual, sequential, plain language. It described the 1841 boundary map and what it showed. It described Pemberton's leather case and Fenwick's 3 specific questions, and the magistrate's precise finding. It described the room and the people in it, and it described Clara Briggs herself in 3 sentences that managed, with economy and without any trace of sentiment, to place her accurately and completely in the world where she actually lived. A woman who had been widowed the previous February, who worked in a laundry house and had 3 children, and had appeared before a court with a county boundary map she had obtained herself at 6 in the morning, who had spoken without notes or counsel and told the truth plainly, and who had then folded the map and walked back to Ludlow. Ward had written those 3 sentences 6 complete times before he was satisfied with them. On the Saturday the Chronicle was distributed, 70 copies reached Shrewsbury, and 40 more went by post to the surrounding villages. 8 copies traveled on the midday coach to Birmingham, in the hands of various regular passengers who took the Chronicle because they liked it. On Monday morning, in a house on a respectable street in the center of Birmingham, a woman named Frances Alderton read Oliver Ward's piece over her morning tea. Frances was 41 years old, organized, direct, and deeply purposeful. She ran a weekly reading group for working women in Birmingham, attended every Tuesday evening, and she read 3 different newspapers each week, without exception, because she believed that the difference between what was happening and what people were allowed to know about what was happening was one of the most important distances in public life. She read Ward's article once and then read it again immediately. She cut it out of the newspaper with a pair of scissors. She placed it in the center of the reading group table the following Tuesday evening, without saying a single word about it, and she sat back and waited. The women read it. There was a brief silence. Then there was not a silence at all. Frances went home that evening and wrote a letter to the Shrewsbury Chronicle. It was 3 substantial paragraphs. She wrote, clearly and without ornamentation, that the case of Clara Briggs illustrated in very precise terms the gap between the law as it was written and the law as it was applied to working women, and that any system in which a woman could be removed from her home and her livelihood because a duke's hunting morning had been inconvenienced by her lawful presence on lawful ground was a system that had not yet fully decided whether women of her class existed inside the law or merely beside it. The Chronicle published the letter on the following Wednesday. By Thursday, 3 more letters had arrived at the newspaper's offices. By Saturday, 11 more had come in, from addresses across Shropshire and the surrounding counties, from factory workers and school teachers, and a retired draper in Telford and a woman in Wolverhampton who signed her letter only with her initials because she was not yet certain it was safe to use her full name. The Birmingham Daily Post picked up the story the following Tuesday, running a shorter version with a heading that spread further than Ward's original piece had. Dismissed for standing on her own ground. The story reached Manchester by the end of that week through a Labour press publication called The Working Voice that had an editorial practice of running in full the stories that the major newspapers covered briefly and reluctantly, and usually only once. And it reached several other cities in the weeks that followed through similar channels. Clara knew none of this was happening. She was living in the 2 small rooms above the cobbler's shop in Ashton Cross Village that she had rented at a cost that pressed her carefully managed finances very close to the edge. She had written 3 letters to laundry establishments in the region and had received 1 polite reply that did not offer her work. She had taken in mending from 2 households in the village that had heard she was available. She had accepted, with the quiet dignity of a woman who has learned to accept necessary things without turning them into a production, a package of coal that her sister Dorothy had sent by the Tuesday carrier without a note, because Dorothy knew her sister well enough to know that a note asking permission would have been refused. The coal burned well. Peter's cough was slowly getting better. On a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the hearing, Clara found a letter waiting at the cobbler's shop addressed to her in a firm, clear hand. The sender's name was printed at the top of the letter, Henry Lowe, solicitor, Great Charles Street, Birmingham. She opened it at the kitchen table while Nell was at the village school down the lane and Peter was sleeping. Lowe's letter was precise and courteous. He wrote that he had read an account of her case in the Birmingham Daily Post and had subsequently obtained the original Chronicle article, and that on the basis of those accounts he believed her dismissal from the Ashford estate was legally actionable, under an expansion of employment protection principles that his firm had been successfully testing in similar cases in the Midlands over the past 3 years. He wrote that he would be prepared to represent her in an appeal of the dismissal at no charge to herself if she chose to pursue the matter. He signed it, for the record. Clara read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table with the winter light coming in gray through the small window. She put it flat on the table and smoothed it with the palm of her hand, the same way she smoothed laundry when she needed to look at it properly and see it clearly before she made a decision about it. She did not know about Frances Alderton. She did not know about the reading group or the 11 letters or the Birmingham Daily Post or the Labour Press publication in Manchester. She did not know that 3 separate newspaper editors in 3 separate cities had, during the past 3 weeks, read about a servant woman who had retrieved a 4-penny county map from a records office at 6 in the morning and taken it to a courtroom and told the truth, and had decided that this was a better story than most of what crossed their desks. She knew only that a solicitor in Birmingham had offered to help her. She got up from the table and went to the window and looked down at the cold cobbled lane below. A cat sat in what remained of the afternoon sun on the step across the way. 2 children were chasing a hoop along the far end of the lane, laughing at something. The cobbler below was working, and the faint, steady rhythm of it came up through the floor. She went to the small drawer where she kept her writing paper and her pen and the bottle of ink that she used carefully. She sat down. She wrote back to Henry Lowe. She said yes. Henry Lowe arrived in Ashton Cross on a Wednesday morning in the first week of December, stepping off the 9 o'clock coach from Shrewsbury, with a leather bag on one arm and the measured, steady energy of a man who prepares thoroughly and is therefore rarely surprised by what he finds when he arrives. He was 44 years old and clean-shaven, with eyes that were steady and attentive, and a way of speaking slowly and carefully that was not hesitation, but was rather the accumulated practice of a man who had learned over a long career that in a courtroom, patience and precision carry more weight than volume or speed. He had practiced law in Birmingham for 18 years. He took cases that other solicitors in his city described as difficult, which in practice meant cases where one party had considerably more legal, financial, and social power than the other, and where the outcome was therefore generally considered, by most reasonable observers, to have already been decided before the hearing began. Lowe had spent several years deciding that these cases were the ones most worth taking. He met Clara at the kitchen table above the cobbler's shop and spread his documents between them, and laid out the situation without softening any of it. The Duke's legal right to dismiss his estate employees was broad and largely uncontested in any jurisdiction Lowe was familiar with. That was not the ground he intended to fight on. What he intended to challenge was the specific basis cited in the dismissal notice, that Clara had obstructed a lawful hunt on private estate land. The magistrate's finding had placed on the formal record that no deliberate trespass had occurred. Lowe's argument would be that a dismissal resting on a stated reason that a court had already found to be without evidentiary support constituted an improper and unlawful use of the Duke's dismissal authority. It was not a straightforward argument, and he said so plainly. "This may not succeed," he said, setting his pen down. "I want you to be completely clear on that before we proceed. The law in this area is not settled. What I believe is that it should be tested through a proper case, and that your situation is a well-suited one for that purpose." Clara looked at the documents on the table, at the certified copy of Fenwick's finding, at her own dismissal letter, which she had kept because she kept everything with her name on it. "What happens to my children if this goes against us?" she said. Lowe paused to give the question the genuine consideration it deserved. "Nothing changes from where you are now," he said. "You are not putting anything additional at risk. Your current situation is the floor. There is no lower position that a loss would put you in." She understood floors. She had been living on one for 11 months. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A complete account, in your own hand, in your own words. Everything from the morning of the hunt in October, through to the day of the hearing before Fenwick. Every detail you remember clearly. I will have it for you by Friday morning," she said. He looked at her across the table for a moment, with the expression of a man who has already formed an opinion about someone, and has just had it confirmed to his satisfaction. He packed his documents back into the leather bag and left on the afternoon coach. The appeal was filed with the county court before Christmas. By the time the newspapers published their Christmas editions, the story of Clara Briggs had reached 3 more regional publications. A women's magazine in London ran a short editorial piece in its January issue titled, "What the Hunt Revealed." A working men's institute in Wolverhampton passed a formal resolution of support at its December meeting, and recorded it in the minutes, and sent the minutes to its newsletter, which went to 4 other institutes across the Midlands. The Duke of Ashford received a private visit from his family's senior solicitor, a very experienced and very senior man named Craven, who travelled from London specifically for the purpose. Craven sat with the Duke in the library for 2 hours and spoke in the careful and measured tones of a man who is not delivering bad news but is very carefully adjusting the frame around what had previously appeared to be good news, and who is doing so in a way designed to give his client the maximum opportunity to respond intelligently to the adjustment. He advised settling the matter quickly and quietly. The Duke declined this advice. This was partly pride, which Craven had fully anticipated, and partly a genuine and sincere belief that when the matter was properly examined by a higher court it would be resolved firmly in his favor, which Craven found privately more difficult to defend, but which was not his role to argue against a second time in the same sitting. The county court hearing was set for the 2nd week of February. Clara spent January in the rooms above the cobbler's shop. She took in mending every day. She made the money hold week by week. She read to Peter in the evenings when his cough permitted it, stories she knew by memory because she had read them enough times. She sent Lowe a second letter with additional details she had recalled about the exact positions and conditions of the boundary stones on the morning she had measured the distance herself. Nell helped around the rooms every morning without being asked, washing and tidying and keeping things in order, with the straight-backed quiet of a girl who has been watching her mother manage difficult things for a long time, and has been filing every detail of how it is done. Oliver Ward wrote a second piece for the Chronicle, shorter than the first, noting simply that an appeal had been lodged with the county court, and that the case had attracted notice across several counties. Griffiths, the editor who had initially wanted to cut the first piece, now asked Ward to follow the story wherever it went, and to keep him informed of every development. Ward followed it. The February hearing was held in Shrewsbury, in the county court building, which was considerably larger than the Ashton Cross magistrate's room and smelled of the same things in larger quantities. Clara arrived on the 8 o'clock coach in the same gray dress, carrying the 1841 map and the certified copy of Fenwick's finding and her written account, with Henry Lowe walking beside her at a calm and measured pace. The gallery was not empty when they arrived. She had not expected anyone there. She had not told anyone to come, and she had not asked anyone to make the journey. But Frances Alderton and 4 women from the Birmingham Reading Group had hired a coach together and traveled from Birmingham the previous afternoon, staying the night at a modest lodging house near the station. 5 workers from the Ashford estate, men and women both, had come on their own time and at their own expense, and were sitting quietly at the back of the gallery. Oliver Ward was in his usual position in the last row, with his notebook open and his pencil ready. And sitting in the second row of the gallery, directly in Clara's line of sight as she entered the room, in a good grey wool coat, was a woman she did not recognize. Her name was Margaret Dunn. She was 37 years old, and she wrote for a London magazine that was read by professional and educated women across the country. She had taken the morning train from Euston the previous day specifically to be in this courtroom for this hearing. She had read every newspaper account of the case she could locate, and she had interviewed Frances Alderton by letter, and she had spoken with Oliver Ward by telegram, and she had formed a clear view of what this case was about that she wanted to test by being in the room herself. Clara walked to her seat. She looked at the gallery around her. She did not know most of the faces. She did not yet fully understand why these particular people had made these particular journeys to be in this particular room on a cold February morning. She knew only that the gallery was fuller than she had expected it to be, and that fullness was its own kind of statement, quiet and specific and present. She sat down. Lowe opened the leather case and arranged the documents in the order he would need them. The hearing began. Judge Hargreaves was a thorough man, and this became clear in the first few minutes of the proceedings when he asked Pemberton a question that Pemberton had not specifically prepared an answer for. He asked about the 1863 boundary survey. He asked, specifically, who had commissioned it. Pemberton paused for exactly 2 seconds. In an ordinary conversation, 2 seconds is nothing. In a courtroom, in front of a judge who is waiting with his pen in his hand, 2 seconds is a great deal of time. The 1863 survey had been commissioned by the 5th Duke of Ashford, Edmund's father, in connection with a property expansion application that had subsequently been withdrawn without proceeding. It was an internal document that had never been registered in the public records. It had been presented in the Ashton Cross hearing by Pemberton's firm as though it were a neutral and authoritative public reference, and Fenwick, who was a competent magistrate but not a specialist in the particular details of land boundary law, had accepted it without pressing on its provenance. Hargreaves had pressed on its provenance before the hearing even began. He set the 1863 document aside and looked at Lowe. Lowe presented his case in the unhurried and precise manner he always used, without drama and without flourish. He walked through the 1841 boundary map. He laid out Fenwick's finding in its specific language. He read aloud the precise wording of the dismissal letter, the passage that stated Clara had obstructed a lawful hunt on private estate land, and he asked the court to note that a previous judicial examination of these exact events had produced a formal finding that no such unlawful act had occurred. Then he presented 6 affidavits. The first 3 came from Ashford estate workers who had personal and direct knowledge of the boundary stones, their original positions, and the changes to those positions over the years they had worked the land. The 4th came from a county surveyor who had gone out to the site the previous month at Lowe's specific request, with a measuring chain and the 1841 map, and who had confirmed in a detailed written statement that the stones had shifted from their recorded 1841 positions, and that the 1841 map represented the more accurate historical boundary. The 5th came from Fenwick's own court clerk, providing a certified confirmation of the exact wording of the magistrate's oral finding. The 6th, and the last, was Clara's own account, written in her clear hand across 2 pages, describing everything from the moment she left the cottage on the morning of the hunt, through to the moment she stacked the wood neatly against the oak tree and walked home. Hargreaves read all 6. Pemberton made his arguments. They were well constructed and professionally delivered and represented the best case that could be made for the Duke's position, and under different circumstances, before a less thorough judge with a less completely documented opposing argument, they might have been adequate. But 3 months earlier there had been no county surveyor with a measuring chain, there had been no clerk's affidavit, there had been no second set of estate worker testimonies, and 3 months earlier Clara Briggs had not had Henry Lowe. Hargreaves called a recess of 20 minutes. The gallery settled into a murmur of quiet conversation. Frances Alderton leaned toward the woman beside her and spoke in a low voice. Oliver Ward turned to a fresh page in his notebook and wrote something. Margaret Dunn sat with her eyes on Clara. Clara sat at the table and looked at nothing specific. She was thinking about the wood, the pile she had stacked neatly against the oak on that October morning before Hewitt came to tell her she was dismissed. She had thought about it a few times since then, wondering whether someone from the estate had taken it and used it, or whether it had sat there and slowly been absorbed back into the forest floor. She hoped someone had used it. It seemed wasteful for it to simply sit there and rot. Hargreaves came back. He spoke with brevity and precision. He ruled that the 1863 survey, being an internally commissioned document that had never been entered into the public land record, had no legal standing as the authoritative boundary reference and could not supersede the 1841 Common Land Map. He ruled that Clara Briggs had been standing on common margin land at the time of the October incident and had not been on private estate land. He ruled that the grounds cited in her dismissal notice were factually incorrect, and that a termination of employment premised on those factually incorrect grounds was an unlawful termination. He ordered reinstatement to her position in the Ashford Estate Laundry House, with all associated accommodation rights restored. The gallery was very still. Then it was not still at all. Pemberton was already writing in his documents. He would file a further appeal to a higher court, and Lowe already knew this and was prepared for it, and they would meet again in a higher room. But the county-level record now existed, formally and completely, with the judge's ruling and the 6 affidavits and the 1841 map, and the surveyor's findings all attached to it as permanent and publicly accessible documents, and that record was not a thing that any estate memorandum or internal correction could quietly erase. Clara did not stand up immediately. She sat at the table and looked at her notes, at the word reinstatement she had written down when Hargreaves said it, and she looked at it carefully and from more than one angle, the way you look at something that has arrived after a long wait, to make sure it is real. Lowe touched her arm once. "We won," he said, in a plain and simple voice. She nodded. She sat for another moment. She was thinking about Peter's cough, which had finally cleared in January. She was thinking about Nell's face on the first evening in the cottage when she had explained they were losing it, the careful, memorizing expression of a 12-year-old pressing a painful thing into a permanent place. She was thinking about George, who had died in February and who had not lived to see any of this morning, and who had never known that his wife would one day sit in a county courthouse with 6 affidavits and a solicitor from Birmingham, and hear a judge say her name and order something restored. She thought about the stag. Nobody had mentioned the stag in any court proceeding. It had walked back into the forest on an October morning, and the law had moved on to other things, and the stag had been left alone, which was probably exactly what it had wanted. She stood up. Margaret Dunn was already at the gallery railing, her notebook open. Clara walked toward the door. Frances Alderton stepped into the aisle and held out her hand without speaking. Clara shook it. She shook 5 more hands from people she did not know who offered them, and she received each handshake with the same steadiness she brought to everything, not overwhelmed, not removed, simply present, and there. Oliver Ward was in the last row. He looked up from the notebook as she passed. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, "one question, if you're willing." She stopped. "That morning in October," he said, "before anyone spoke to you, before you heard the horses, did you have any sense at all that something important was about to happen?" She considered it with genuine care. "No," she said. "I was thinking about the weight of the wood." He wrote it down. She walked out of the county court building and into the sharp February air, and stood on the top step with one hand on the cold iron railing, and she breathed it in, the winter air of Shrewsbury, smelling of frost and stone and the particular clean cold of a river town in February. The coach home to Ashton Cross left at 2. She had a letter to write to Dorothy. She had a conversation to have with Nell that evening, a new weight to place carefully in the collection of things that 12-year-old was so steadily and intentionally storing away. She had a cottage to reclaim. Her children could come home to their own beds. She released the railing and walked along the Shrewsbury street in her mother's dress, and she was not yet thinking about what the newspapers would say, because she did not know yet what they would say. She was thinking about the road home. Margaret Dunn's piece appeared 3 weeks later in a London magazine, with a circulation of 30,000 readers across the country. It was titled, "The Ground She Stood On." It ran to 4,000 words, and it was the finest piece of journalism written about the case, thorough and precise, and written from a perspective that brought the significance of the specific story into clear connection with the much larger and older questions it illustrated. Dunn had traveled back to Birmingham after the hearing to speak at length with Frances Alderton. She had spoken with Oliver Ward by letter and in person. She had spoken with Henry Lowe and with 2 of the estate workers who had provided affidavits. She had read every document in the county court file that was publicly accessible. She had put all of it together into something that was not simply a report of events, but an examination of the machinery that had produced them, the legal framework that had required a widowed laundry worker with 3 children to obtain a boundary map at 6 in the morning, and take it to 2 separate courts before a judge was finally willing to confirm that her ordinary unremarkable presence on ordinary unremarkable ground was lawful. Ward read the piece twice when it reached the Chronicle office, and kept his copy. He wrote Dunn a letter. He said she had done the subject justice. He meant it, and it was not a small thing for a young journalist to admit about someone else's work on a story he had found himself. Dunn wrote back, so had she. The further appeal that Pemberton filed on the Duke's behalf was heard 8 months later in a higher court. Lowe contested it with the county ruling, the 6 affidavits, and an additional document that had arrived in the intervening months from the county land office in Shrewsbury, a formal review of the boundary question that had been initiated as a result of the county court proceedings, and that concluded, in measured administrative language, in Clara's favor. The higher court upheld the county ruling in full. The reinstatement stood permanently. The Duke's estate issued no public statement of any kind. The law did not change that year. Legal change at the level of formal statute moves at the pace of many specific cases accumulated over time, pressing from many different directions against the same thin and resistant place in the same wall, over years, until something finally gives way. Clara Briggs was one case among others that were happening in the same period, in different counties and different industries, and together they were one generation of cases among others that had come before them, and others that would come after, and the weight of all of them together, over time, eventually moved something. What changed immediately was smaller and more personal, and in some ways more permanent than a statute. It was the thing that happens when a story is told clearly and accurately, and reaches people who carry it with them into rooms where it meets other stories, and is held alongside them, and compared. And the comparison produces a name for something that previously existed without one. Margaret Dunn had put the name in the last paragraph of her piece. She called it the distance between where a working woman was legally permitted to stand, and what actually happened to her when she stood there. She wrote it plainly, without rhetorical decoration, and the people who read it carried it forward into letters and meetings and discussions and eventually into places where that kind of language meets the language of law and stays there. Clara Briggs went back to work in the Ashford Estate laundry house on the first Monday of March, the year of the hearing. She arrived at her usual hour. Hewitt received her without ceremony, which was his way and always had been, and she respected it exactly as it was. He had, in the weeks following the February ruling, filed a written correction with the estate's internal records office, noting in plain administrative language that the grounds for the original dismissal had been overturned at county court level and upheld at the higher court level, and that the employment record of Clara Briggs should be corrected to reflect this. It was a small act, filed quietly, with no audience, and it was the kind of act that certain practical and decent people perform when the circumstances around them have arranged themselves in a way that finally makes it possible to do the right thing, without the cost being more than they can reasonably pay. The laundry house smelled exactly as it always had, steam and wet cotton and the particular mineral quality of the eastern well water. The wooden paddles were smooth in the same places they had always been smooth. The soap was the same soap she had always used. The light came in through the high south-facing window at the same angle she had always worked in, slightly west of south in the morning hours, falling across the same stone floor she had walked on 4 mornings a week for 4 years. Clara pressed the first sheet of the first load through the wringer and turned the handle. The work was the same work. She did it. The Duke of Ashford hunted the eastern quarter of his estate for 11 more autumns, until his health made riding difficult. He never saw the Stag again in any of those years. He never mentioned this to anyone in his household or in any of the company he kept during those years, and the people who knew the story of the Stag and the hunt and the servant woman understood, without being told, that this was one of those things that is carried in silence, kept carefully and quietly by the people who know it, set down only when there is no one left who remembers. Nell grew up. She became a school teacher and taught at the village school in Ashton Cross for 31 years. She was known by the students she taught for many things, including a particular emphasis when she explained that documents mattered and records mattered, and that the precise and correct language of a legal document was sometimes the only real protection a person had when everything else had been removed. She kept a copy of the 1841 county boundary map on the classroom wall beside the chalkboard, mounted carefully behind a small glass frame. When students asked about it, she explained it to them exactly, specifically, without extra drama, because she had learned from her mother that the plain and specific truth, told correctly and in the right order, was always more powerful than a story shaped to impress. Peter's cough went away completely in the spring following the hearing. He grew up healthy and became a carpenter and had 4 children of his own, and on evenings when his eldest daughter asked him about his earliest memories, he told her about the cottage and the forest and the wood and the stag and the duke and the cold October morning, the way his mother had told it to him, beginning always with the weight of the wood. On a Thursday morning in June, many years after the February court hearing, Clara sat at the kitchen table of the cottage, the same cottage she had been returned to, and she opened a letter from a parliamentary committee in London that was gathering written evidence on working conditions and common land rights, and the legal position of estate and domestic workers, and that had been directed to her by Henry Lowe, who had maintained a correspondence with her for several years, and who thought her account would be useful to the committee's work. She got out her writing paper. She took her time. She wrote the account in the way she wrote all things that needed to be written, plainly, in the correct sequence, without leaving out the details that showed her uncertainty, or her tiredness, or the ordinary human ordinariness of what she had done, because leaving those things out would have made it less true, and it needed to be completely true to be of any use. She did not begin with the Duke. She did not begin with the gun, or the echo of the shot rolling across the frost-hardened ground. She did not begin with the stag. She began with the wood. She wrote that she had been collecting fallen wood from the forest floor on a Thursday morning in October 1887. Because the winter was coming and wood purchased from a merchant cost money she did not have. She wrote that she had been standing on the right side of the boundary stones, where she had always stood on those mornings, doing the same thing she had always done. She wrote that a man had told her to move, and that she had not moved, not because she was making a statement or trying to challenge anything or anyone, but because she was cold and her arms were full, and she was standing in the correct place on the correct side of the line. She had always been standing in the correct place. She folded the completed letter with care, the way she folded everything that mattered, and she addressed the envelope to the London Committee's office and set it on the table for the morning post. She went to bed. Outside the cottage window, the June night was warm and still, and the Ashford estate lay quiet in the dark, and the old forest at the eastern boundary of the grounds was deep and full of its own sounds, the small and unhurried sounds of things that move through the dark without requiring anyone's permission or approval, the creak and settle of old wood, the soft shift of something moving between the close-standing oaks, deep in the place where the light never quite reached the ground, and the old boundary stones sat in the earth exactly where they had always been, exactly where the 1841 map said they were. Nobody went to look. Nobody needed to. The map said where the line was. The line had always been the line. Clara slept.